Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 94 called Did Justinian Make or Break the Roman Empire? So we're reaching the end of Justinian's long and eventful reign, and in this episode I want to discuss his legacy and try to answer the vital question of did he make or break the Roman Empire? One thing's certain. Justinian wasn't modest. For example, beside Hagia Sophia, he built the tallest triumphal column in the ancient world with an equestrian statue of himself at the top. It was taller than Trajan's column in Rome at 125 feet and taller even than Constantine's in Constantinople as well, 131 feet, although we'll never know its precise height since the Turks destroyed it in around 1500. It could have been over 200 feet tall. Procopius, tongue-in-cheek, tells us it presented an image of power, quote, stretching forth his right hand towards the rising sun and spreading out his fingers, he commands the barbarians to advance no further, end quote. But was this an accurate reflection of his achievements? For when he died in 565, the empire was bankrupt and a tributary of its two main enemies, Persia to the east and the Avars to the north. And for his successors, his legacy proved a poisoned chalice. Catastrophe beckoned in the form of an apocalypse in the early 7th century. After a devastating war between Rome and Persia, the Arab tribes united for the first time in their history under a new religion and a new political entity called the Rashidun Caliphate. They destroyed Sasanian Persia forever and reduced the Roman Empire to a shadow of its former self, a medieval state we call Byzantium. The ancient world was dead. The Roman Empire had ceased to exist in all but name. The Dark Ages had arrived. We'll look at all of this in future episodes, but we can still ask how much of the 7th century catastrophe was Justinian's fault. Many historians exonerate him from culpability. After all, these events occurred after his death and were the fault of his successors, weren't they? Wasn't it their incompetence that led to the catastrophe? I disagree with this view. Instead, I suggest the origins lie fairly and squarely in Justinian's reign. Let me try to explain by discussing 4 questions. First, were Justinian's Western conquests worth it? Second, did he leave the empire in a worse or better state than the Emperor Anastasius? Third, how significant was the plague? Fourth, why is Justinian's legacy so well remembered and indeed revered, in contrast to emperors like Anastasius, whose names have all but disappeared from the history books? The answer to the first question is, I suggest, fairly simple. No. One major reason is that the value of the conquered territories to the imperial government was low. The tax revenues from North Africa and Italy were small compared to those from the wealthy parts of the Eastern Empire, such as Egypt and Syria. The eminent economic historian of the late Roman and Byzantine empires, Michael Hendy, has suggested that at best the newly conquered territories contributed a quarter of the empire's total tax revenues, which he estimates to be 4 million solidi. He describes their economic contribution to the wealth of the empire as a, quote, dead loss. This point is so important that it's worth quoting in full his summary analysis. Quote, the financial position of the prefectures of Africa, Italy and Illyricum vis-à-vis that of the East was almost absurdly weak. The budget of Africa alone amounted to barely a tenth of that of the East, on the basis of a budget of 4 million solidi for the latter, and the budgets of Africa, Italy and Illyricum combined amounted to barely a quarter of that of the East. In the long term, that is, not forgetting the acquisition of the immediate contents of the Vandal and Ostrogothic treasuries, and as a source of surplus revenue, Justinian's reconquest was a dead loss. End quote. Part of the reason for the low tax revenues from the western provinces was that war had devastated these territories, as discussed in episode 91. In particular, Italy was reduced from being a relatively prosperous economy under the Ostrogoths, with large urban centres such as Rome, Milan, Naples and Ravenna, to an economic wreck. Rome itself, as we've discussed, rapidly became a medieval village with its aqueducts cut and its senate, who were the guardians of what wealth remained in late antiquity, dead and dispersed. Then there's the question of estimating the cost of conquering North Africa and Italy. While Belisarius' blitzkrieg demolition of the Vandal state in 533 was remarkably quick and successful, North Africa wasn't actually pacified until 548, when John Triglita finally crushed the Berber insurgency. Therefore, it took 15 years after Belisarius' victory to stabilise the province. During those years, and if we include the cost of Belisarius' initial expedition, the net gain to the imperial coffers was probably a little more than the value of the Vandal treasure Belisarius seized. Meanwhile, the balance sheet for Italy was undoubtedly far worse. Although Justinian saved money by failing to provide Belisarius with sufficient troops to finish the job, the army he gave Narses in the early 550s was the most powerful Roman military expedition since Leo's failed expedition to Carthage in 468. It must have cost a fortune. Admittedly, it succeeded, whereas Belisarius had failed, but did it pay for itself? I very much doubt it. The 20 years of warfare in Italy, as I just mentioned, left the country economically broken and incapable of recovering the cost of conquest. Finally, and this is a very important and often overlooked point, the cost of Justinian's western adventures should include the massive destruction in Mesopotamia and the Balkans consequent upon the removal of the best troops from these areas to fight in the west. Although we can't estimate the costs of the destruction wrought by the Kutrigas and Slavs in the Balkans with any accuracy, or Khosroes' devastating invasion of Mesopotamia in 540 and sack of Antioch, although, for example, we know Justinian invested £5,000 of gold in rebuilding the city, we can be fairly certain that there was a considerable loss of tax revenues and need for investment, such as at Antioch. Overall, although it's impossible to estimate a figure, I suggest the cost of Justinian's western acquisitions left a sizable hole in the imperial budget. And this was one of the main reasons Justinian's state was bankrupt when he died, compared with the £320,000 of gold left by Anastasius. So this leads neatly into the second question, which is, did Justinian leave the empire in a worse or better state than Anastasius? I suggest Justinian's reign can usefully be measured against that of the forgotten Emperor Anastasius. Like Justinian, Anastasius ruled for a long time, 27 years versus 38, and was, I contend, much more successful. For example, by not embarking on Justinian's wars of reconquest, he left the empire with an overflowing treasury and well-defended borders. In his war with Persia from 502 to 506, after initial setbacks, he defeated Rome's traditional foe in a way Justinian conspicuously failed to do. He also gave Justinian the platform on which to embark on his wars of reconquest, as Procopius tells us, quote, he left the state full to the brim with tax revenues, end quote, which Justinian, quote, dissipated in next to no time, end quote. This positive contemporary commentary about Anastasius contrasts with the many negative comments about Justinian. For example, his successor Justin II was scathing about the dead emperor once the required period of mourning was over. According to the chronicler Carippus, Justin told the senators, quote, many things were too much neglected while my father Justinian was still alive, and as a result the exhausted treasury contracted many debts, end quote. He added that the major casualty of the depleted treasury was the army. Quote, "For lack of necessities, the army has reached the point of collapse, with the result that the state is suffering from innumerable attacks and incursions by barbarians." End quote. Both Procopius and Agathias echo this view. As mentioned in the last episode, Agathias blamed Justinian for reducing the army from 645,000 to 150,000 soldiers, a force completely inadequate, he tells us, to defend the empire's extended frontiers. The most eloquent of Justinian's critics, Procopius, makes the point even more fiercely in The Secret History, where he describes Justinian sucking the sea dry as he voraciously overtaxed the empire and still failed to balance the budget or pay the army. Quote, "I shall now proceed to relate how Justinian appropriated all the money he could lay his hands on, first mentioning a dream vision which at the beginning of Justin's reign appeared to one of the senators. He reported how, in his dream, he seemed to be standing somewhere in Constantinople on the seashore exactly opposite Chalcedon, and that he saw Justinian standing in front of him right in the middle of the channel. First, Justinian drank up all the water of the sea, so that from then on he seemed to the dreamer to be standing on dry land, as the waves didn't break on the shore at this point. Then more water appeared, choked with masses of filth and rubbish and pouring out of the sewers on both sides. This Justinian drank up as well, laying bare once more the bed of the channel." End quote. Like Agathias, Procopius is also insistent that Justinian's neglect of the Roman army was disastrous, particularly his policy of not paying them. Quote, "The Roman emperors before Justinian's time stationed huge numbers of soldiers on all the remote frontiers of the Roman Empire, particularly in the eastern region, as a means of stopping the incursions of the Persians and Saracens. These troops were called limitanii. The Emperor Justinian treated them with such indifference and niggardliness from the start that their paymasters were 4 or 5 years in arrears with their pay, and when peace was declared between the Romans and the Persians, these unfortunate men, on the ground that they too would enjoy the blessings of peace, were forced to make a present to the treasury of the pay due to them for a stated period. Later, he deprived them even of the name of soldiers without giving any reason. From then on, the frontiers of the Roman Empire were left ungarrisoned, and the soldiers suddenly found themselves dependent on the generosity of those who were accustomed to charitable acts." End quote. Counterfactual history isn't always helpful, but let's use it this once to posit a simple imaginary scenario. Let's pretend Belisarius never invaded North Africa and Italy. What would the effect have been on the Eastern Roman Empire? It would have probably resulted in well-defended borders, a more solvent treasury, and no tribute required to be paid to Persians and Avars, just as happened in Anastasius's reign. The only potential loser would have been Justinian's prestige. And that's a point worth focusing on, since there's no doubt Belisarius's victories, especially those in Africa, immeasurably strengthened Justinian's political position at home. The recovery of Carthage had been such a long-standing Roman aim, and one that had so spectacularly blown up in the face of the Emperor Leo when he failed to achieve it in 468, that it wouldn't, in my view, be pushing the comparison too far to say that Belisarius's reconquest in 553 was a little similar to Hitler's triumph in defeating France in 6 weeks in 1940, compared with the costly and prolonged German defeat on the Western Front in the First World War. In conclusion, we can certainly say his Western conquest helped Justinian to hang on to the throne. But the evidence suggests the cost to the empire was crippling. Our third question is about the plague. How significant was it? Many historians use it to let Justinian off the hook. No one says that the severe natural catastrophes, climate cooling, famine and the bubonic plague were his fault. And that's obviously true. As well, Justinian's response was reasonably sensible. In Constantinople, he appointed a capable administrator, Theodore, to move the dead bodies out of the city. He responded to the economic disruption by debasing the coinage and trying to limit wage increases. But would Anastasius have been more effective? Yes, I suggest he would, mainly because the imperial budget wouldn't have been so overstretched. Therefore, Anastasius could have spent more on helping the cities to manage the plague, and he wouldn't have needed to debase the coinage. The main point with the plague is that it caused some sort of economic recession. How severe this was is unknown. Some historians think the archaeological record doesn't suggest a widespread economic collapse, such as occurred in the early 7th century when the Persian invasion led to the destruction of many cities. Others say the plague had an enormous impact. My feeling is that if the 14th century Black Death killed up to half of Europe's population, then the Justinianic plague is likely to have had a very serious impact. This is a significant positive in Justinian's appraisal, since he can't be blamed for the plague. For example, without it, Belisarius would probably have been given the resources to conquer Italy and destroy the Goths, if not in the late 530s, at least in his second Italian tour of duty in the 540s. But the plague wasn't all negative. In some areas, Rome benefited from it. For example, it's fairly certain Persia suffered from it as well, at least in its cities, which prevented Khosroes from continuing his war against Rome in Mesopotamia in the mid-540s. However, I still contend that if Justinian hadn't overstretched the empire in the 530s with his western adventures, it would have been in a better financial and military situation to absorb the plague's consequences. Finally, we need to consider why Justinian is one of the best remembered of all Roman emperors. I suggest two fairly self-evident reasons. One is his legal code, the other is his magnificent buildings. The former is unquestionably vital to the development of modern Western law, as any lawyer will tell you. But did it materially benefit the empire? I don't think so. The motivation behind it, like everything else with Justinian, was self-promotion. We shouldn't overpraise him for his legal code. Often overlooked is the fact that the code's real value lay with the 1,000 years of Roman legal history which went into it and which had nothing to do with him. The second point is his building programme. Hagia Sophia in particular is seen as testimony to his greatness. But again, how did it benefit the state? I suggest we should regard his buildings in the same way Procopius did in his false homily entitled The Buildings. Procopius's praise is tongue-in-cheek, knowing that they were expensive vanity projects, albeit with some exceptions such as the cisterns and other public utilities, and they further depleted the treasury. For example, if the money spent on Hagia Sophia had been spent on Belisarius's Italian campaigns, they might have been more successful. Moving on to the wider issue of Justinian's cultural legacy, this too looks fairly uninspiring. As Gibbon, who despised Justinian, said, quote, "He was regulated not by the prudence of a philosopher, but the superstition of a monk." End quote. The society he nurtured was intolerant, brutal, and, as many commentators have said, it marked the final extinction of the liberal culture of ancient Greece and Rome. For example, Julian the Apostate would have been horrified by Justinian. What of Justinian's character? We can't overlook the insights provided by Procopius's secret history, despite its hyperbole and burlesque veneer. Although many of Procopius's remarks have been spiced up for effect, for example, saying, quote, "He was by nature an extraordinary mixture of folly and wickedness, inseparably blended," end quote, Others are quite convincing, such as that about his callous brutality. Quote, "In a gentle voice he would order tens of thousands of quite innocent people to be put to death." End quote. Equally, I can just picture his deceitful manipulation. Procopius describes, quote, "This emperor was dissembling, crafty, hypocritical, secretive by temperament, two-faced, a clever fellow with a marvellous ability to conceal his real opinion." End quote. Of course, none of Procopius's character assassinations should come as any surprise. Top of a Roman emperor's CV had always been brutality, deceit, and hypocrisy. Procopius hints that Justinian's professed Christianity was also a facade. Quote, "He seemed to be a convinced believer in Christ." End quote. In truth, he was probably intensely superstitious, as were so many in his time, and sought to win God's approval, or at least to appease his anger. Did he exhibit any of the Christian virtues of charity, humility, and honesty? I think we can safely say no. Justinian's legacy was a poisoned chalice, as Justin II was quick to point out. His legal code and Belisarius's Western conquests have provided an image of success which has disguised the harm he did to the Roman Empire. He bequeathed an overstretched and weakened empire that would ultimately succumb to the challenges of the 7th century. It wasn't his fault that famine and plague occurred in his reign, but it's little wonder Procopius wondered if the two were connected, and Justinian must be a, quote, demon in human form. The clock is ticking on the Roman Empire. The countdown to catastrophe has begun. As we draw to a close, I can't help thinking of Justinian's imposing equestrian statue looking down on Constantine's city, impishly usurping his place. And Shelley's poem Ozymandias springs to mind. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." If Shelley could have seen Justinian's statue, perhaps his poem might have had a different name. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. So, Justinian is dead, and we've reached another milestone in this podcast. The next season will be about the catastrophe in the 7th century when Rome and Persia nearly destroyed each other and were in turn overwhelmed by the Arabs. Because of holidays and other things, we'll start this new season in a month's time on the 27th of July. And I'd like to ask a favour. If you like the podcast, could you leave a review and or recommend it to a friend? That would be great. The podcast is entirely free, requires no subscription and doesn't even have adverts. And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes to find books, maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening and see you next time.